So hello, I'm Marguerite Trocmé for the Federal Road Office in Switzerland, and I will talk to you today about the biodiversity and highway verges as a road asset and how we're integrating that in management. So first, a quick review about road verge functions. So from a constructive point of view, stabilization, erosion control, landscaping, protection against natural hazards, landslides, protection against emissions for outlaying countryside, and for us today, most important is ecology. In 2015, we set 2 new standards for highway roadsides defining new management goals. Guideline on highway verges and a guideline on how to define biodiversity hotspots on the verges. These guidelines define best practice, giving quality objectives for roadside verges to reinforce biodiversity through design and management, and explains management requirements to fulfill the biodiversity goals. So our 6 main objectives for highway verges are to enhance integration of the infrastructure in the landscape, to enhance buffer zone function, to reinforce positive corridor effects and linkages, to maintain and enhance biodiversity in defined areas, avoid and contain invasive plants, design verges for cost-effective maintenance. This was an important detail. Overall management objective is to set aside 20% of green areas for biodiversity with special management plans. We have about 4,000 hectares of green areas, so this 20% is really can be quite a big contribution to biodiversity in Switzerland. The classification of the roadside landscape, we have intensive maintenance areas, which are the first 2 meters generally, with mowing a number of times a year, or the priority is security. So this is not going to be where the biodiversity area is. And this is important because some of our maintenance crews were handling everything intensively. So to get them to restrain the intensive area to 2 meters was the first big step. Then we have the low maintenance areas, and we really want to keep these 2 areas distinct to enhance corridor effect and ecological networks and enhance biodiversity. So here, the maintenance principles, we always have to consider security and traffic flow. So that's is a constraint, but it's a very important one. Differentiate between intensive and extensive zones, and the cut height of the mowing, a minimum of 10 centimeters. This might seem like a very strange detail, but it's actually very important because they were mowing before almost to the ground, with implications for soil and also for invasive plants that would come in. And we try to have maximum intervention zones of 500 meters so as to promote refuge areas for vegetation and fauna. Preventing invasive species is becoming an ever more problem and important goal. So enhancing biodiversity through design and management. Design being, for instance, creating little structures for reptiles. Management being a more extensive maintenance. The guideline for setting biodiversity hotspots, and this is interesting because there will be a workshop later on in the week about a cedar project, EPIC, and I've seen that we're really on the same wavelength. So we're looking at good potential for roadside biodiversity. So what is the area large? What is the sun exposure? Are there presence of protected or rare species? And also, for instance, the need of connectivity. So sometimes it's not large, but we're connecting to fauna passages outside the the wildlife fence. So promoting biodiversity on roadside verges through species selection. So, for instance, very diverse shrubs, native, slow-growing, extensive grasslands. And so this has started, as I said, in 2015, and this is what you'll start seeing on some of our highways now, these little flowers that indicate for our maintenance crews, here is a biodiversity hotspot. So when they're mowing, they stop, they'll go on later, and that area will be mowed in a different way. When mowing, we leave 10% as retreat refuge areas for the fauna, so within the biodiversity hotspots. And one of the big now questions is how can we find mowing machines that are more biodiversity friendly? We have a new research project starting with Germany and Austria. And if people are interested in that, we also have the research team, or one person of the research team who's here. We can maybe talk about that on Thursday in the workshop on EPIC. So we have this new guideline on, so this is our objectives, what we're doing, but how do we assess this? And we decided to take the same type of assessment we use for bridges, for surfacing. We consider biodiversity on our verges as an asset, a road asset. So if we're looking at bridges or any other part of the assets, so we have something going from very good, green, to alarming, red. So it's a scale of 5. And so the question was, how do we scale this for our green areas? So the evaluation criteria for verges, since it's not looking at the quality of the biodiversity, but are our management strategies being fulfilled? So is mowing height respected? Is the hedge structure diverse? Is the floristic biodiversity of meadows and hedges, is it good? Faunistic biodiversity of meadows and hedges, is it good? And are the invasive species being managed? So I'll give just two, 3 examples of the assessment criteria. For instance, for meadow quality. So the idea is we're not going to be doing inventories. We're sending out people who are not necessarily specialized. So we use something that we use for ecological compensation in agriculture, which is something we do a lot in Switzerland. And so we have criteria with points, and we give, for instance, 4 points when the meadow has yellow, red, blue flowers, because it shows diversity. We're not looking at the species. Or, for instance, 0 points if there are no flowers. So it's very simple. Assessing faunistic diversity, so we're looking at faunistic groups. Are there butterflies? Are there bees? Are there snails? Are there lizards, reptiles, etc.? And there'll be a number of points depending on how many faunistic groups you find. Another example, we also look at the position of the wildlife fence. This is part of the criteria. I didn't explain it before. So is the low maintenance area outside the wildlife fence, meaning that this can really contribute to connectivity? So that gets a maximum points. Or is, as you see on the right side of this picture, is the vegetation inside the wildlife fence, which means that actually wildlife cannot really use, or part of the wildlife cannot use this vegetation. And so it will get few points. And so all this, this is something we have not yet published. We're in the process of publishing this new guideline for assessing the asset of biodiversity. And the idea is to follow over time how our green areas evolve. So this will be done in rotation. We won't be doing the whole highways at once, about 10, 15 kilometers per year in different areas. And it will give us a picture of whether we're going the right way, the wrong way, and where do we have to have corrective measures. So thank you for your attention.
Wonderful stuff. Any questions for Marguerite? Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Marguerite. I like the very simple approach. My question still is, who is going to do the assessment and how regularly are you going to assess?
So the idea is there'll be every year, so the people who are doing the assessment are actually the people who are supervising the maintenance personnel. So that level, who are actually giving the money out to the maintenance. And they will have to hire somebody, but it doesn't necessarily, so probably biologists, but it doesn't have to be somebody who's going to do very complicated censuses. And we have 5 different areas for our highways. So in every area, they will do about 15 kilometers or 20 kilometers per year. And, well, actually more than that. The idea is within 5 years, they should assess the whole network of that area. Yeah, exactly. So with every 5 years. This is what we do for bridges. This is what we do for surfacing. So it's the same cycle.
You mentioned biodiversity-friendly mowing machines. What would be the properties?
Well, for instance, there's some mowing machines. So generally, because we're really trying to work economically, we use mulching, and that's very destructive to biodiversity. So for the invertebrates, but also for the flora. And so one machine that's has been developed has these kind of chains in front of the mowing that is supposed to scare off the invertebrates, the grasshoppers, etc., so that they leave the area where it's being mowed. These are things that need to be tested. We don't, so we're talking about monitoring and batchy tests and things like that. This is things that the industry is starting to propose because they see we're asking for this, but we don't know whether it works yet. So this is going to be the research that we're going to be doing.
Thank you, Marguerite. And that can, one more? One more here, yes.
I mean, but there were other questions, so that was the last one. I think there was another question already. Yeah.
I don't know if this is a wise choice, but I have actually 2 questions, but please say if we could talk about it later, because one thing is the time where you do the maintenance. Have you taken that into account? You know, you might change
the season.
The season you might. And the other one is when you ask people to see if there's a lot of nice flowers like blue and white. Have you taken that into account too? Because, for instance, if you send people out to do it now, there aren't that many nice flowering blue and white things, but they might still be there. I'm a botanist, by the way.
Right. Yeah. So, I didn't go into the details. So obviously, the assessment will have to be during the flowering period. Otherwise, it doesn't work. So that's for the second question. And for the first question, for the biodiversity hotspots. So when the maintenance, for instance, see flowers, they know they don't mow that then. And depending on what the issue there is, it might be late fall mowing or even early mowing, whatever. So they know they have something saying, well, this is what you've got to do here. But they leave it as they sort of do the whole highway because it's really everything is done otherwise at once. Yeah.
Did you want to ask your question?
Somebody up there.
Thank you. Very interesting presentation. I wonder if, because in Sweden we worked quite long with the species with row verges and trying to maintain biodiversity along the roads. And nowadays we start to talk about different successional stage that is actually our own vegetation and that it has its own successional stages. And it's not just about mowing, it's also about the other maintenance by scraping, digging out ditches. And have you considered that too in the inventories, in the strategy?
Yeah, so I focused in this presentation on the grasslands, but we have a lot of hedges and semi-woods and shrubs, and there's also criteria and objectives for that. So to keep, for instance, a very diverse type of hedge, because certain types of practices have really made them completely monospecies. So we want to go against that, yeah. And so I'm afraid we have many languages, but not English in Switzerland. So you will find some of these publications in French, German, and sometimes Italian, but not in English. But there's always a big English summary.
So, my last question maybe would be, what can you do with the biomass that you're generating? Can you use it as for instance, for generating green energy, or is it treated like waste, so you have to dispose it?
It really depends on what are the opportunities in that area, because we don't want to be transporting biomass across Switzerland. So sometimes we use it for biogas, and sometimes it's used for composting. It also is a big question of whether there are invasive plants in it. So I'm just talking about the normal mowing. So if there's invasive plants, then it's got to be biogas, because the composting will promote seeds. And often it is actually burnt. And something which I have not thought of, but the maintenance crews said, is when we have biodiversity hotspots, we're mowing much later. And so the linen is much higher, and you cannot compost it anymore. And that's an issue we're going to have to deal with.
And that will need to be the last question. So that's the end of the first session.